Until we moved to Echo Lake Ranch, our dad had spent his life in the wide-open, sunny spaces of the high desert. He thrived in the sun, and that was something in short supply at the ranch. The ranch nestled in a narrow valley that cast shadows for much of the day. George could handle the cold of winter, but he may have struggled a little with the day-to-day darkness of the valley. Other than that, I think he was pleased with our life there. Every year seemed to come with improvements. The generator ran 2 light bulbs in the house and a tiny refrigerator, most of the time at least. Once in a while we would run out of gas. There was a bridge on the creek upstream where Angus and Hazel's cabin was. That's where our dad dug a trench from the creek to the house so he could run a pipe for water. That was hit or miss. It would freeze in winter, and in summer my brothers were constantly sent to clean out the dead frogs and snakes that would get caught in the pipe at its source, preventing the flow. It was still an improvement. There was a family that moved to Cherryville a few years after our arrival. Pogue and Bede Donnelly and their daughter Kathleen held a peculiar fascination for Twist and I. It had to do with how they interacted with one another. They never raised their voices, not even to Kathleen, which our mother thought was dreadful. The mutual respect they held for one another was obvious in the kindness they constantly shared with one another. Kathleen had probably never found herself on the receiving end of a spanking. Our mother would have considered that child neglect. This was such a strong contrast to the moments of volatility that were gradually growing frequent in our own home between our parents. The Donnellys resonated with Twist and I as odd. It was a huge deal one day when our dad came home with a brand new Volkswagen van. He boasted to his friends about the superior engineering and functionality of it every chance he got. He was pretty proud, as was our mother, except for one thing. With a bunch of kids to haul around, it sure would have been nice if it had more than just a front seat. We always had a couple of milk cows on our farm. To keep the milk flowing, our cows occasionally needed to produce calf, and that's why our cow Betsy was temporarily staying at the Zimmers farm. The Zimmers lived along the road to Lumbee, just past the fishing camp, and our families had become close friends. Our father had worked out a deal with Fred Zimmer. Betsy would be bred with Fred's bull. A few weeks had passed since the successful mating, and one sunny afternoon our dad decided to take my brother Twist and me to visit the Zimmers in his brand new Volkswagen van. Fred's son, Freddie, was close to our age, and he joined us and we ran and played in the fields. When we would get close to the Zimmer house, we could hear George and Fred laughing heartily, sharing tall tales. We didn't pay much attention to their banter. Our focus was on the fun we were having. But then Fred mentioned something unexpected. He was getting tired of feeding Betsy. Perhaps it was time for George to take her back home. Our house wasn't far away, so initially, Dad thought he'd drop Twist and me off and then return with the truck to get Betsy. That's not what happened. The Volkswagen had a wide side door and no back seats, just a metal casing covering the rear engine, creating a makeshift ledge. A rear window allowed fresh air to flow through. Our dad, always resourceful, had an idea.
You know, Fred, I bet I could get that cow in my Volkswagen. I could just take her home today.
Fred made it clear that he saw some obstacles with that idea, but he reluctantly agreed to give it a try. While Fred and our dad grabbed a halter and a rope to go get Betsy, Twist and I climbed into the front seat of the Volkswagen. It was a real treat since we always had to sit over the engine or on the floor in the back if all the kids were with us. Before we knew it, our dad was standing outside the open side door of the Volkswagen, awkwardly trying to pull Betsy in as Fred was shoving from behind. Betsy was adamant in her refusal to step up onto the metal floor of the vehicle. George had another great idea. If he pulled the rope from the back window while Fred pushed, the cow would be forced to put her feet inside. Betsy put up a pretty good fight, but it worked. The cow had an even bigger problem when it came time to get the back feet in, but eventually she was in the Volkswagen with her head over the engine and her tail over the seat where Twist and I were sitting. It was really a tight fit, and the cow had to lean forward over the engine while her rump rammed tightly against the back of the front seat. Fred was shaking his head, still not convinced that this was a good idea, as George was joking and thanking him for his help. Twist and I just thought it was pretty funny. At first, it was. Apparently, all the commotion had made Betsy pretty nervous, and Twist and I, being familiar with some animal behaviors, suddenly quit laughing when we noticed that Betsy's tail had gone up. We both shrieked as Twist scooted as close to the passenger window as he could while I scooted towards the steering wheel. We moved just in time. The contents of Betsy's bowels began to slither down the back of the seat. It felt like the mess was never going to stop as it slowly slid all the way to the floor. Our shrieking got our dad's attention, and when he realized what was happening, he, of course, called on the magic of his cuss words. But this time, pardon the pun, they utterly failed him. Our dad looked at his boots and shook his head before deciding that we were close enough to just head home. Me and Twist had to stand up in front of the seat to keep from getting any of it on us. We only encountered one car on the road between the Zimmers and the lake, and it was no one we recognized. Sometimes I entertain myself by imagining what the people in that car must have been thinking as they processed what was behind the windshields they drove past it. Two bug-eyed kids on each side of a cow's rump in a Volkswagen? Surely their eyes were deceiving them. Our dad had decided that the cleaning up of this mess was more in our mother's wheelhouse than his. She, like Betsy, was really unhappy about the whole affair. Getting Betsy to back out of the Volkswagen certainly proved to be no small task. When he was an old man, our father told me that he had never seen anyone as beautiful or loved anyone as much as he'd loved our mother. There was intense passion between them. If only he hadn't been such a knucklehead, it might not have erupted so often in anger and frustration. Our poor little orphan mother at some point began to unravel. Abandoned as a child by her mother and deprived of her father, she had foolishly thought that George was the guy who was going to fill the hole in her. But that's not what happened. In our father's defense, I'm not sure anyone could have filled the hole in her. She was born with so many gifts that seemed to go to waste over the years of isolation and deprivation in that beautiful little valley that she seemed to love. She marveled at the splendor around her, and she taught us to appreciate it. She loved to point out the sound of the loons at the lake and was thrilled one day when she heard a rumbling of rocks falling from the granite wall rising where the hills met the lake. She at once knew what the two white spots on the rock face were: mountain sheep. It was far from a daily occurrence, but we learned to search the rock to look for the white spots every time we heard the rumble. She had once met a huge moose while walking downstream near the creek. The splendor was not enough to keep her brilliance from going to waste. There was too much time alone and not enough books or time to read them. She had wanted a big family, and while the babies filled her with the love she craved, the responsibility began to suck the life out of her. She must have craved stimulation as much as she craved our father's attention. There is a historical book of Cherryville that for a number of years kept a record of the people in the community, along with a description. The book shows a photo of our mother and father sitting on the porch step of our cabin with a caption that reads, "George and Carolyn Gates lived at Echo Lake Ranch. They were known as very sociable people with a lot of kids." We mingled with the good people of Cherryville as much as anybody, but it still left a lot of alone time, even for us kids. The road to the school bus brought us out of the green valley, rich with timber, to an arid place we appropriately called the Flats. There was a place on the road we called the Switchback. It was at the base of a steep incline where the road made a 145-degree turn left. Just before the switchback, there was a little meadow with an abandoned house and crabapple trees. Sometimes in late summer, we'd see a bear in the crabapple tree eating the crabapples. The Lasowskis, the Myers, the Chenards, and the Werners all lived on the Flats. We did see quite a lot of them. Twist and I remember playing a game with Georgie and Diane Lewis, which was short for Lasowski, where we would see who could hold on to the electric fence the longest. Diane was a pretty determined girl. She won a lot. The elder Lasowskis lived in the big house by the pond. Georgie and Diane lived in a small rustic house at the end of the Lasowskis' lane where the school bus stopped. They moved away, and Albert and Barbara Lasowski moved in with their 2 children, Linda and Jerry. I would sometimes spend the night with Linda in her grandparents' house. We would sleep on the 2nd floor with strict instructions to never take the stairs to the 3rd floor as it was unsafe. Needless to say, Linda and I found the 3rd floor pretty fascinating in spite of the warning. I wonder if Mrs. Lasowski ever knew that we could not resist those unsafe stairs. It was around 1959 that a hepatitis epidemic broke out and Barbara Lasowski was hospitalized. I had spent a night with Linda, and while she and Jerry avoided the virus, I did not. According to our mother, I was quite sick, probably sick enough to not be conscious for most of it, as I remember waking up in the hospital room with Barbara Lasowski. I remember nothing else. Luckily, we both survived. The straight road on the flats was not paved, and every once in a while, our dad would encounter a big dust ball hurling its way towards him on the road. He knew that was Joe Lasowski, going to beat 60, as he would say. Joe, barely in his 20s, was the youngest of the Lasowskis' sons, and we girls thought he was incredibly handsome. It was Joe who would organize the skating parties, though I'm sure our mother helped. There was no colder place in all of Cherryville than our little shady valley in winter. On the road to the fishing camp, there was a place on the bank that was not steep, and we could access the lake. Our mother one day dropped the 3 of us off with our skates so Snooky, Twist, and I could skate to the fishing camp. This was nothing like skating on the Lasowskis' pond. The lake had about a 6-inch layer of snow, and the ice was incredibly bumpy. Our mother had warned us to look out for the holes that the fishermen had bored in the ice. However, the layer of snow hid the holes. Movement of the lake underneath caused waves that slammed the surface, making a loud, ominous sound, which I found frightful. It didn't seem like a good idea to me, but our mother had left us there for a while, and Twist and Snooky would have left me there, so I had no choice but to participate. At least we didn't have to worry about the bears, as they were still hibernating. It turned out to be a great adventure, but I was only 9 years old and Twist and Snooky were 7 or 8. What was she thinking? It wasn't often we got to see a movie in Vernon, and it was a pretty big event when we did. I remember seeing the movie Toby Tyler about a boy who ran away and joined the circus to become a trick horseback rider. We happened to have 2 huge workhorses named Midge and Marge. I would tie Midge to the tree in front of the fence near the house and stand on the fence to climb on her. Twist would untie her, and I would pretend to be Toby Tyler standing on the horse's back as she walked around the barnyard. The Lasowskis had electricity, and Albert and Barbara were the first to have a TV with an antenna. You could barely see the picture through the static that sometimes overtook the image altogether. I remember being terrified when we saw The Thief of Baghdad, even though the images were barely recognizable. Our father raised sheep and grew grain and was rarely at the house during daylight hours. There was no better time of year than when the little lambs were born. There were always little orphan bummer lambs that needed to be bottle fed, and we kids would fill Coke bottles with milk and a big black nipple for their nourishment. Our mother was probably not as thrilled with the night feedings of more babies than she had birthed. As the lambs grew, they would play together just like a pack of little kids jumping straight up in the air. There is nothing as joyful as watching little lambs play. Our mother had an incubator, and every so often a small flock of baby chicks would arrive at the ranch. Twist and I would adopt a chick. The little creatures would run desperately after us, thinking we were their mother. Unfortunately, we usually loved them to death, and then we would cry our hearts out. But when it came to little animals, you couldn't outrank the Lasowskis. Every once in a while, Joe would find a fawn to rescue. But it would never take long for the fawn to get big enough to show his wild side, and we'd be told we couldn't play with it anymore. While still running the ranch, our dad finally managed to complete the mill, and Twist, Tom, and I went to watch as he ran the first log through it. Arden had financed the build. The sawmill was located in the trees across the bridge from the upstream cabin. The mill was powered by a gasoline engine, and it took some tinkering and magic cuss words to get the first log through. Between the ranch and the mill, our dad was working day and night, but it was going to all be worth it. We were headed for Easy Street. There was no way for George to operate the mill by himself, so he had hired help. There was never enough time to get the lumber delivered to the lumber yard in Lumbee before it closed. Week after week, he'd been dropping off loads of lumber in the middle of the night with a note to the yard securely fastened to the load, stating that the lumber belonged to him. He assumed that the workers at the yard would be the first to find it, and they would just credit his account. He became a little worried when weeks passed and there was still no check in the mail. Meanwhile, he just kept delivering lumber. The lumber yard was on the way to Lumbee, and we'd driven past it many times. Twist and I were with him one day when he stopped. I wonder if that was the day he decided to check. One strange night, I was awakened from my upstairs bedroom by the sound of glass breaking as if it was thrown against a wall. It seemed to go on forever, and I was pretty scared. I woke the next morning thinking it was a dream. Suddenly, things changed. Our mother had disappeared, and Grandpa just showed up, dropped off Grandma, and went back to Oregon. Did he take all the little kids with him? They were gone too. Twist and I actually enjoyed the peace and calm. Grandma made us feel like everything was all right. The only thing we were ever told is that we were going to be moving to Oregon. We never even noticed that the Volkswagen had disappeared as well. One afternoon, Twist noticed our dad at the dining room table looking through a photo album. George offered to share the album with Twist, who sat beside him and began to marvel at the photographs of our mother. Twist was in awe.
Mama sure was pretty, wasn't she?
She still is twisty.
2 days before our Grandpa Gates was supposed to come get us to complete the move, we went to say goodbye to the Lasowskis. I remember standing at the fence that bordered the backyard of the big house with a tree-lined meadow behind it and thinking, I will never see this place again. It made me quite sad. I had no idea where my mother and siblings were. All I knew was that a big change was in the works. The lumber project was expensive, with men to be paid and machinery to be paid for. Our dad and Arden had financed it all, and there was no money to pay it back. Our father had gone to the RCMP about the stolen lumber, but since he couldn't even prove that he'd delivered it, there wasn't a thing they could do.